Before we speak of climate change, there's a lot of talk on climate change now. We won't dwell into what causes climate change because I think that's another discussion. But if you speak of climate change, you can't talk of climate change without speaking of climate and without speaking of the weather. Baseline is the weather. Weather is basically the state of the atmosphere. What we are feeling now, we know the temperature is at the moment now it's 20 degrees Celsius here in Pretoria, Hatfield. So that's the weather. So weather is basically what's hitting us now, what we're feeling now, and climate basically is what we are projecting in the future, the average of the weather in Pretoria, not today on the 1st of September, but within September in the future. So climate is the average of the weather. So if you speak of climate, we're basically speaking of the average of the weather, for instance, in January. We're speaking of the average of the weather in February, December, etc. And aligned to that now is if you put in the word change, you're now speaking of that climate, that average weather, the weather, for instance, in Pretoria, we know in June, we know it's cold. In Pretoria, you can put maximum temperature, the minimum temperatures in Pretoria. So that's we know that that's the temperature in June in Pretoria within the last 10 years. Okay, we know at least plus or minus. If we speak of the change, we're speaking of in the next 10 years or in the next 5, 10 years, in 2030 or in 2025, how will the climate in June in Pretoria be? So the change basically refers to the June temperature in Pretoria in 2020 versus the June temperature in Pretoria over the last 10 years, 5 years. So that's where the climate change comes in. Aligned to that, why is it important if you speak of the extension service or extension is to understand climate and how they can convey that message to the end users, the farmers in this regard? It is always critical to understand the terminologies that are used with regards to the weather, the climate, and climate change. For the simple reasons, basis you're speaking of agriculture. If you speak of agriculture, it's very dependent on the weather and the climate. That's one of the main variable. Of course, there are other variables you can speak of. But if you understand, for instance, to say yes, there's climate change, and climate change can be aligned to, it can be linked to other global events that happen in the world. And there's also climate variability, which might not be aligned to climate change per se, but it's happening because not every year is the same, not every season is the same. So just an understanding of to say there's an extreme event that happens, for instance, in place in your location as an extension is every 10 years, for instance, there's a likelihood of a flood happening in your area every 10 years. Having that an understanding to say every 10 years plus minus 2 years, there will be a big event happening with regards to the weather, the climate events. Knowing that, as well as understanding to say that variability might not be due to climate change. It might be due just a normal phenomenon. Okay, it happens every 10 years. And then understanding now the differentiation between climate change. If you put in the factor of climate change, how is that extreme event, that flood, going to be affected as a result of climate change? So instead of that event happening every 10 years, you put in the variable of climate change, it might be happening in 5 years as an example. So from a planning perspective, from a risk perspective, you will be able to guide your end users, your farming community with regards to how they can plan for those events happening in the future.